Okay, hello Bio 16. So we are going to be working on Chapter 19, the endocrine system right now. If you have any questions, please be sure to send me an email or log into online office hours. So one of the things that we're going to be paying attention to right now is how the endocrine system acts differently than the nervous system to maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis is the coordination of the organs and body systems to maintain kind of a happy, healthy, normal functioning of the body. And so the nervous system and the endocrine system do cooperate. They work together. The nervous system, however, communicates differently and gives short-term communication and short-term responses to changes in stimuli in the environment. The endocrine system, on the other hand, has much longer lasting effects. So endocrine system works through hormonal secretion and hormonal response, whereas the nervous system works through cell-to-cell communication. There is communication, chemical communication happening between cells, but the way I think about it is nervous system is one cell talking to the other. Endocrine is more like a loudspeaker, so you have one signal going out to talk to many different target tissues at one time. And so what's happening with those hormones is that the hormones secreted by organs involved in the endocrine system, those hormones are going to change the chemical and metabolic responses of different organs, and they're all going to happen pretty quickly, about the same time. So here's a slide showing you the difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Of course, you remember that the nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cords, ganglia, nerves, and so forth. But basically, in nervous system communication, you have electrical impulses carrying information. In the endocrine system, you have hormones, chemical messengers, sending signals from the source out to target cells. So one of the things you need to remember is that a target cell is going to have a receptor on it that allows the hormone to interact with it. So it's like individuals knowing languages. If I speak in Spanish, all the Spanish speakers will understand me. But if you don't speak Spanish, you won't understand me. You don't have the Spanish receptor available for understanding. So let's move into the endocrine system here. The endocrine system includes all the cells in the body, all the endocrine cells and tissues of the body. Endocrine cells are going to be glands, typically, that secrete hormones into what we call interstitial fluids. The interstitial fluids are going to be that salty solution that you find between cells. And the interstitial fluids are usually going to be encapsulated. However, there are some places where endocrine secretion happens directly into the bloodstream. We'll get to that. What's happening when a hormone hits a target? Well, the target starts behaving differently. And what we say is that the target changes its metabolism. Remember, metabolism is the series of chemical events that happen inside of a cell. And so it's going to change how protein number 1 gets converted to protein number 2 and on and on. So what's really going on here is that by a hormone interacting with the cell, you're changing how the enzymes inside of that cell control metabolic reactions or control chemical reactions in the cell. So what are the metabolic and endocrine glands that we're going to be talking about today? We have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the brain. We'll get to that. The pituitary gland, also associated with the brain, has two portions, the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. The thyroid gland, which you're going to find close to the trachea. The parathyroids, which sit right on top of the thyroid. The adrenal glands, which are what we call suprarenal. The adrenals look like little hats sitting on top of the kidneys. So supra on top of renal, kidney. We have the pancreas, which you can't necessarily see really easily in this figure unless you're looking right here under the stomach. There's the pancreas. The pancreas is going to help with digestive response, insulin, glucagon, and so forth. Sex organs, the ovaries and the testes, thymus, pineal, and there are other tissues, but we're going to mostly focus on this first top list right here down through the pineal. So how is the endocrine system causing changes to occur within the body? Usually endocrine responses are what we call negative feedback responses. And what happens is you'll have a process trigger a reaction, and then the reaction turns off the process. What? Okay, there are 3 steps that are going to happen here. I'll show you a picture in a minute. What's first going to happen is the endocrine cells are going to respond to something that happens. Let's say a disturbance in homeostasis, and that disturbance could be you've eaten something sweet and your blood sugar has gone up. It's not really a disturbance, but it's a change, okay? That's going to trigger the release of a hormone. After the hormone is released, it enters circulation sometimes. Sometimes it stays local, but it depends on the system. And once that hormone hits the target cell, it's going to stimulate the target cell to change something about its metabolic processes. That response is going to then restore homeostasis to the overall system. So an endocrine cell stops producing the hormone after the response is signaled. It's a really complicated chain of events that induce and control and regulate negative feedback. There is also a process called positive feedback, which we will talk about more another time. But positive feedback, briefly, triggers the secretion of a second hormone. So you'll have a process that starts hormone number 1 being made, hormone number 1 then makes hormone number 2 be secreted, and so on. And so in this positive feedback process, this allows a process to happen in an accelerated process. It rushes the whole loop to its eventual end. And so in this case, when you have secretion of a hormone, the effect is going to regulate other steps down the line, and then eventually that hormone's going to get turned off. When the hormone's complete, or when the process is complete, that initial hormone is no longer needed, therefore the process stops. So for the most part, we are going to be focusing on negative feedback because for the vast majority of endocrine activity, you're looking at negative feedback. All right, so the endocrine system regulates growth, some of us more than others, right? It regulates growth via the pituitary gland, regulates water balance by also means of the pituitary, reproduction by means of the testes, ovaries, and pituitary, because the pituitary axis is going to be regulating the production of gametes. Endocrine system regulates overall metabolism or use of body energy, and that's done via the thyroid. The endocrine system also helps regulate calcium, blood glucose levels, and when we say calcium, that's going to be the calcium that's either going to be put onto your bones or reabsorbed from your bones for other processes. That's regulated by the parathyroids. Parathyroids regulate calcium, and the pancreas regulates blood glucose levels, which many of us are very familiar with insulin and glucagon reactions. And then the endocrine system also allows us to respond to stress by regulating the adrenals. So this idea of negative feedback. One of the examples that we use a lot in biology for negative feedback is the example of temperature. And temperature regulation works a lot like a thermostat in your home. So the thermostat itself senses a change in temperature. As the change in temperature is sensed, it sends a signal to the thermostat and switches heating off or on. So let's say the temperature is too high. Then it turns off the heater. Once the heater's off, the room temperature decreases because you're not pumping new heat into the room. But let's say it's cold outside. Then the temperature going down triggers the thermostat to detect that you need to turn the heater back on, right? So you switch the heating system back on because now it's too cold and the room temperature increases. So the idea is that, let me see if I can get my pen out. Let's say you want, oh boy, I'm going to try to write with my pointer. Let's say you want, I don't know, let's say 75 degrees in your room, okay? And your heater's going and the temperature, if it's in my office, it's going to be 85 because I always have my little heater going. But the thermostat senses that as too hot. So then we switch off the heating system. Ooh, look at that. That went too fast. The room temperature decreases, and now let's say the room temperature gets to 72 degrees. Well, then I'm too cold. That's going to turn the system on, and now we will start heating back up to hopefully 75 degrees. So the idea is that you have an oscillation in temperature, up and down and up and down. But this right here is your set point, which I have arbitrarily defined as 75 degrees, right? This happens with a lot of different things. This happens with your, well, blood glucose is regulated pretty stably. Your body internal temperature is regulated. But there are set points that oscillate and change over time. We have a set point in your body weight. Your metabolism adjusts to maintain a specific body weight. You can retrain your body to some of those larger elements, but for the most part, the really critical set points that are required to keep us alive, because those set points maintain homeostasis in terms of protein and enzyme shape, like body temperature, 98.6. That is what it's going to be. Too high, you're going to have problems. Too low, hypothermia, you're going to have problems. So we're going to start with the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is, well, part of it. The hypothalamus does a lot to regulate our body. It produces antidiuretic hormone, and that's what it sounds like, antidiuretic, which means you're not going to pee a lot. When we're talking about diuretic, we're going to be talking about water regulation in the kidney. Oxytocin and other regulatory hormones. So, the hypothalamus. The nervous system and the endocrine system works together to regulate secretion of regulatory hormones via the pituitary, which is a part of the, which contains some of the endocrine cells. So we have releasing hormones, or RHs, and inhibiting hormones, IHs. The hypothalamus is going to make ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. These are both transported to the posterior, all right, so the back lobe of the pituitary for storage. The pituitary holds on to hormones in the posterior lobe. The anterior does something different. The autonomic center regulates endocrine cells in the adrenal medulla. So we're going to call this sympathetic stimulation of autonomic hormone release. So the pituitary is a key part of regulation with the hypothalamus. So you have the hypothalamus sitting on top of the pituitary. I'll show you a picture in a minute. The pituitary is divided into two lobes, the anterior and the posterior. The anterior lobe can also be called the adenohypophysis, which we have here in red, right? And the posterior is the neurohypophysis. Now, going back one slide, you're going to remember that that regulation of the posterior pituitary means that things like ADH and oxytocin is transported there, but it's stored there until you need it. So the pituitary itself, the hypophysis, is a small oval gland that sits in this stella tunica, and basically it's a small set of cells that it's connected to this stalk called the infundibulum. The infundibulum then holding the pituitary, which you guys might remember from our brain dissection, the pituitary then separates into the anterior and posterior lobes. The anterior is very glandular, and it produces 7 hormones, okay? And the cells in the anterior produces those hormones itself. The posterior, the neurohypophysis, remember, is storing ADH and oxytocin, and it sits there until it's given the trigger to release using releasing hormones. I'm going to stop now. This is video A. I'm going to pick up on the pituitary in video B.